Harley-Davidson's Low Rider S. This bike was introduced in 2016 on the Dyna platform with the 110 cubic inch twin cam engine. That bike proved to be both the magnum opus and the swan song of the Dyna line. A few years later, we saw Harley-Davidson create the 2020 Low Rider S, the first version on the Softail line, which they have now updated with this bike here, the 2022 Harley-Davidson Low Rider S with its 117. Aesthetically, this bike remains very similar to the 2020 model, but there are a couple key upgrades that really change the riding experience. So let's get into what those upgrades are, what we found through our testing, and how they affect the ride on this new bike. Getting straight into the engine, which is the real star here, that 117 visually looks about the same as the 2020 model. You've got that textured black finish. You do have the 117 marking on that heavy breather intake. This engine puts out 94 horsepower at 4750 RPM, and it puts out 115 foot-pounds of torque. Compared to our most recent Milwaukee 8114, which was the 21 Street Glide Special, this is over 14% increase in horsepower, just a couple of foot-pounds of torque gain. But what that equates to in real life is good, smooth, ready, usable power. With these large engines, a lot of the time, the initial fueling, the initial crack of the throttle can be very abrupt. But what Harley's done here is it's very smooth and linear and easy to get the bike to do exactly what you're asking of it with your right hand on the throttle. If you get excited, which is easy to with this big engine, and grab a handful of the throttle and dump the clutch, it's gonna spin tire because it doesn't have an IMU, it doesn't have traction control, it feels very analog in that sense. Again, hot rod character, but when you are in the twisties and with a little bit of finesse, this thing is just, it's beautiful and it's actually pretty easy to control. So many will say just as important as the style of the bike is the sound and the feel of that engine. Visually, the exhaust pipe looks pretty much identical to the 2020 model, but with the 117, the sound has so much more presence. It is just this deep resonance that I can't help but just flipping the throttle when I'm riding around. It is so satisfying. Harley-Davidson has a way of tuning all the touch points on their motorcycles. Specifically in the Softail line, you can compare this bike to the Heritage 114 that has large floorboards with rubber pads, and the vibration is much more isolated to the handlebars and the foot pads. But on this bike, you feel much more directly connected. You feel more of the shake and the vibration of that engine. But again, that's sort of just channeling the hot rod spirit. It's a little bit more stiff, it's a little bit more analog, it's a little bit more connected, but that's what you want on a bike like this because it lets you feel what it's doing and respond directly. So the other major update that we see for the 2022 Low Rider S is the rear suspension. Front suspension remains unchanged from 2020 model, but in the rear, they gave us what we asked for. Riding the 2020, smaller shock of the Softail line, and we wanted the taller one that we saw in the Fat Bob model. We knew Harley had it, they were just holding it back. Now they've given us this shock, it's an inch longer. It gives us an inch more ground clearance. It gives us a ½ inch more stroke. It gives us an extra inch of travel. So not only do you get an extra 1.2 degrees of lean angle, more ground clearance, all of that, but you get longer stroke. You get more suspension to work with, and you can feel it. It gives it more capability, a little bit more confidence out here chasing the canyons. Ergonomics on the Low Rider S are very much defined by the club style aesthetic, and the club style aesthetic is very much defined by performance ergonomics. So you see a tall sort of straight bar off of T-bars, the little fairing here, mid controls for your feet, and a solo seat. A lot of taller riders will complain about the mid controls, say that it's uncomfortable for them on longer rides. I'm 6'4", I love them. When I'm out hitting the canyons, it allows me to shift my weight a little bit more than I could with forward controls that leave you just planted in the seat. So I think it gives you a lot more control. Also, with this model, if you were to put forward controls on it, I'd be hitting my knee on that intake. So I'm really happy with it just as it is. I did do a few hours out on the highway the other day. I got a little bit of discomfort in the hip flexors at first, but it wasn't persistent. It went away pretty quickly. Well, forwards, yeah, sure, they're gonna be comfy on the highway. It's a trade-off for maneuverability in the canyons, and on this bike, I would take that trade any day. So many things that define the Low Rider S look. You know, you have the bronze cast aluminum wheels, you have the little fairing here, the solo seat, the staggered 2-to-2 exhaust. All of that remains unchanged. Traditionally, Low Rider models have 2 tank-mounted gauges. So Harley's changed that now, moving the gauge to a single one right here on the handlebars. that's really my one complaint about this bike, is if you're moving away from something that is traditionally lowrider to go to something that's more functional, why would you keep an analog gauge on a $19,000 bike in 2022? We know that they have a digital round gauge. We've seen it on the Sportster S. So that's a bit of technology that I would have loved to see here. Yes, we know this bike is a little bit more analog. It has a little bit more of the hot rod feel, but some modern amenities and a little bit of tech like that, I think would be appreciated. Overall braking performance on the Low Rider S is adequate. In the rear, you don't have a lot of feel. You can sort of stomp the pedal and hope for the best. In the front, you have really good feel until you get deep in the lever. And then both the road test editor Michael Gilbert and I found that ABS felt a little overactive. It's kicking back on the lever a little bit much, but in our testing, we saw 60 to 0 in 135 feet, which is a pretty good number for a bike of this weight. You do lose a little bit of the feel deep in the lever. That ABS is working. Compared to the 2020 model, Harley got a lot right with this Low Rider S. The larger engine is smooth, powerful, usable, and linear. It does what you want it to. There's just more of it. The shock in the back is a great update for any sort of rider. You get a little bit more stroke for highway comfort. You get greater ground clearance, greater lean angle for the canyons. It improves the bike's rideability in just about every way. So that's it for our review of the 2022 Harley-Davidson Low Rider S. If you like what we're doing, like, follow, subscribe. And for the full review, head over to cycleworld.com where you can see our full performance numbers and specs as well. Thanks for watching.